Hi Soccer 1010 students, my name's Dr. Julia Cook. I'm one of the sociology academics here in the department at Newcastle, and I'm here today to talk to you about race and ethnicity. So in terms of what I'm going to cover in this lecture, I'm going to start with a section on understanding race and racism. I'm then going to move on to section 2 and talk to you a bit about theories of ethnicity. And then section 3, intersectionality and hybridity, which is complicating some of these kind of categories of race and ethnicity. And then finally, we're going to have a bit of a case study focusing on refugees, asylum seekers, and Islamophobia. So to start with, we're going to talk about race and racism. So in terms of kind of understanding race, race obviously raises some rather kind of complex questions in sociology. If I ask you, what do you think about when I say the word race? I'm sure that racism and ideas about prejudice and power pretty quickly come to mind. And so, we can see from that the kind of very idea of race is inseparably linked to notions of white or European superiority. And we know as well that the kind of concept of race was invented by Europeans, and this was taking place in the context of colonization, slavery, genocide, and forms the basis of racial thinking today. So it's really no coincidence that it can feel like a very kind of loaded concept or a very contested area to talk about, but I'm hoping that, by discussing this concept today, I can give you some ideas and some language that, can help you to think about race as well as, related concepts of ethnicity, intersectionality in a more kind of comfortable but also critical way. And so I think as well, we're talking about some of the kind of history around race and racism because, whenever we discuss these concepts within a contemporary context, we do need to also, keep this history in mind. And so in terms of what race actually is, amongst social scientists, race is generally understood as a socially constructed concept. So that really just means that it's a concept that we understand not as having a kind of intrinsic, undeniable truth to it or being based on an unquestioned truth, but instead as something that is kind of developed by the ways in which we understand it and talk about it amongst ourselves. And I think we can see this in relation to race by looking at how ideas about race have changed over time. If it was a fixed concept, that would be unlikely to be happening. So, race does refer to kind of physical differences between groups or races of people, but it also includes the kind of the socially constructed belief that the human race can actually be divided into these discrete and exclusive groups based on physical and cultural traits. And so, this might sound kind of contradictory in a way, but what I'm saying here is that, yes, race is based on some kind of physical differences that are perceived between individuals, but the question of, where we draw the boundaries between races, who's included within and who's outside of a given kind of racial group, that's a very kind of open question. So, we can think of the concept of race as social in the sense that the divisions between races are not something that's inherent and fixed. And so in terms of sociological research on race, there's been a lot of kind of argumentation, particularly amongst anthropologists as well, around the kind of scientific basis of race and whether you can actually use scientific methods to determine the kind of biological difference between races of people. Some argue yes, some argue no, but this isn't necessarily of central interest to sociologists who are focused on race. So sociologists are not so interested in these kind of biological debates and are more interested in how ideas about, perceptions of, the way that we talk about and think about race shape our social behaviour and shape how we understand race. So, how do we socially define race and racial groups, and how does that kind of impact on people's everyday lives and on how we understand each other and treat each other. And really central to this is the role of power. So I'm sure from the lectures that you've had so far in this course, you have a good sense that sociology is quite focused on power, inequality, discrimination, those kind of related topics. So it's really no coincidence that the kind of question of race and issues of racism are of sociological interest as they pertain to ideas about power. And so when we think about racism, we can kind of put again these debates about whether race is real or not, and whether we can define differences between races biologically to the side, because we know regardless of the kind of biological status of race, the social status of race forms the basis of racism and discrimination. Like we treat people differently in some cases in a way that's determined by the race that we perceive them to be. We'd call that how they're racialized. And so I think on that basis it's important to keep in mind that the whether or not race is kind of biologically measurable, it is socially significant, and our ideas about race shape how we understand people and how we treat them. And so moving on to a kind of definition of racism. So racism occurs when kind of mainstream people or societal structures, so those that have a critical mass and have power within society, when these people and structures systematically discriminate against persons on the basis of moral judgments about race that are based on their perceived physical characteristics and which flow over into ideas about what kind of people they are. So, this is those in positions of power making moral judgments based on physical characteristics, which then flow into and inform how they understand or think about the kind of moral character of these particular individuals. So we can think about this in relation to like negative stereotypes, for instance. So it would be racist to say that all members of a certain racial group, understood as those who look a certain way, are bad at something, or are maybe even that they're good at something, but the insinuation being not necessarily positive. Like we can think of stereotypes about people being good at something and therefore inherently kind of bad at other things. So anyway, another example of this is denial of service on the basis of race. So we can see some pretty awful signs from different historical moments that are showing denial of service and discrimination on the basis of race. So this is clear examples of racism. And so going back to I mentioned a few minutes ago that we really need to think about the kind of history of race and ideas about race to understand racism. So colonization is really central to this. So we know that histories of colonization shape the kind of politics of migration and diversity in the global north, where settler colonies like Australia have kind of a historical relationship to colonizing power. And we know that the kind of occurrence of racism is an ongoing concern in Australia. So just to unpack that a bit, so the global north refers to countries, what we in previous language might have called developed countries, countries that generally have more resources, more geopolitical power. So this would be places like America, like the United States, European countries, particularly Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, those kind of contexts where global power is more likely to be concentrated. And so it's not a coincidence that several of these countries, we think about Australia, the US, Canada, they're settler colonies, or they were colonial powers in the case of the UK and Europe. So we can think about how ideas about race have kind of come from this history and may continue to flow through to the present. And so we can see that racism's taken particular forms in societies such as Australia, Canada, the US, where we have mass immigration and multiculturalism, and that's resulted in more ethnically diverse populations than we may have had 50 years ago, for instance. And we can see, like in the Australian context, for instance, we've in the past had some quite kind of racist neocolonial policies, such as the White Australia policy, which blocked non-white migration for many years. There's still a kind of denial that racism is a problem, or that racism takes place in the present in Australia. And we can see this in political discourse. So we can see that politicians use some particular kind of tactics to deny accusations around racism. So we can think about this in relation to current debates about immigration and ideas about migrants taking up housing, and international students as maybe again taking up housing, taking up jobs that would go to the wider Australian population otherwise. And we can think about how those debates in some cases have very, very kind of racial overtones. And we can think about, if we're thinking about kind of criticisms of migration, are those criticisms related to the countries that people are migrating from? Would they be the same criticisms if people were migrating from like the UK and Europe versus other parts of the world? When we're looking at the kind of, I suppose, recent history of racism, we can see that there's a movement which we've talked about a little bit, and this is similar to changing understandings of race itself, but there's been a movement from a focus on biological difference to a focus on cultural difference. And you can maybe see this in some of what I've been talking to you about so far, particularly in relation to kind of colonial histories and how they've maybe filtered through to the present and how things have changed over time. So in the 19th and 20th century, racism was justified based on scientific terms, and it was the foundation of something called eugenics, which is basically a school of thought that believes that some humans are kind of socially or biologically unfit and therefore should not reproduce, and that we should take a really active role in ensuring that the gene pool has only the traits and individuals in it that are seen as socially desirable. So this is one of the ideas that fueled the Holocaust, and I'm sure you can see how that logic flows through. So at this point in time, race was considered to be a biological or natural categorization, and as Western colonialism and slavery expanded, the concept of race was used to justify and prescribe exploitation, domination, and violence against people who were kind of racialized as non-white. So an example of this would be colonial violence towards Indigenous communities. And then if we move through to the present, we can see that there's not necessarily as much of a kind of biological focus on race. So no one is like openly and explicitly talking about ensuring that certain races don't reproduce, or I suppose acting on these eugenics based ideas, but we can see that there is still a kind of a similar narrative in a way. We're not so concerned about the kind of like biological mechanisms at play. We're more concerned about, if we think about debates around migration, for instance, we're concerned about having like too many people migrating, and we're concerned about diluting the kind of cultural identity of host nations, the kind of culture being under threat. We can think about discussions of like threats to the Australian way of life, for instance, and so I think you can hopefully see that although there's a kind of difference between the biological versus the cultural framing, there's a similar logic at play here. There's a similar idea of trying to kind of control the number of people from certain races that are within a kind of given society, and an idea about the kind of dominant group, often the kind of white group, as being in a position to determine how much is too much, and to kind of make these decisions about like who should be welcomed into or included within the society. And and so thinking about kind of sociological definitions and understandings of racism, we can also draw distinctions between individual versus institutional racism. So individual racism refers to an individual's racist assumptions, beliefs, or behaviours, and it's a form of racial discrimination that stems from conscious and unconscious, as well as personal prejudice. And individual racism is connected to and learnt from broader socioeconomic histories and processes, and is supported and reinforced by systemic racism. So this was first defined by Stokely and Hamilton. So I'm moving on now here to institutional racism. So Stokely and Hamilton understand institutional racism as kind of particular and general instances of racial discrimination, inequality, exploitation, and domination in kind of organizational or institutional contexts. For instance, the labor market, the nation state. And so I think you can see the difference here in terms of like individual racism is based on like individual beliefs and behaviors, whereas institutional racism is structural. So, it's embedded in institutions. It's embedded in the kind of patterns that we see in the labour market, for instance, in terms of who gets hired and who doesn't. In the nation state, if we think about whose visa is approved and whose visa is not approved, and institutional racism in some cases can be kind of quite obvious and quite easy to see, but it can also be something that's a bit more difficult to detect. So we can think, for instance, about maybe racial profiling at the airport. So there's generally a sense that those that are visibly racialized, particularly, for instance, those that are wearing a hijab or a burqa, or something that would identify them as being part of a particular kind of religious or racialized group, there's a sense that they're more likely to be targeted for kind of extra scrutiny and screening. And I have heard that from people in my life who do like have some of these like visible kind of forms of racialization, but there's plausible deniability in terms of the airport security can say, oh well, we just screen people from every social group, and like that's just a coincidence that we screened two of these particular types of people at the same time, or one after the other. So yes, the point that I'm making here is that institutional racism can sometimes be quite difficult to detect, particularly if we don't have access to good quality data about, visa decisions or about success within the labour market. And so we can also think about the kind of concept of the new racism. So this is a kind of move in terms of like the kind of old racism, as we could think of it, was maybe this really kind of overt, blatant racism, and it's not socially acceptable in the vast majority of spaces to be explicitly, overtly racist and to overtly discriminate against people, but that doesn't mean that that doesn't happen anymore. So the kind of new racism is something that is a bit more difficult to detect. It's more subtle and covert, and it's often based on discourses of being colorblind. So the idea of, oh, we just treat everyone the same, but maybe maybe the kind of outcomes are still unequal, and there's a sense that even though there's a kind of official policy of being colorblind, treating everyone equally, that's not necessarily how things play out. And it's also important to note that this can be the kind of outcome of implicit biases. So it can be that people believe that they don't have any kind of racial beliefs or racial prejudice, but they may not be aware that they kind of hold these beliefs or make these kind of basic assumptions. So if we're thinking about the kind of impact of the kind of assumptions and values and ideas that we put onto race, and how quickly we are socialized into them as children, there's a really interesting kind of study and then recreation of the study that kind of illustrates this point. So I'll let you in your own time have a look at the YouTube video that is linked on the slides here. But basically, in the 1940s, two psychologists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, designed and conducted a series of experiments that were known as the doll tests, and they used these tests to kind of study the psychological effects of segregation on African American children. And these experiments have been recreated, and some similar findings have emerged. And this is following the end of segregation, so you might think that that things would be quite different. So basically, in these videos, as you'll see, some very young children, aged around 4, are shown different dolls, so white dolls and black dolls, and they're asked, which of these dolls is pretty, which one's smart, which one's the better doll, and even the African American children will generally point to the white doll, which I think at that age you can already see these internalized kind of racial ideas and biases are already very much at play. So I think this particular experiment and its recreations are really interesting because they show the kind of power of our ideas about race and our kind of construction of racial hierarchies and the kind of assumptions and values that we put onto them, and it shows how early we're socialized into these ideas. And then finally, for this section, when we're thinking about how racism is kind of circulated and normalized, it's really inseparable from the media. So we can see that the media plays a crucial role in shaping public ideas about racism, and it's generally tended to reinforce racism. So we can see, for instance, this is back a few years ago now, but in the late 2010s in Melbourne, you might have seen reporting about kind of African gangs. There was a really large amount of concern about African gangs and a kind of, reign of terror facing the Melbourne citizens. And when you actually kind of drill down into it, it was difficult for police or anyone related to them to identify any African youth gangs. So it seemed like even if there were a couple of cases, the level of concern that was associated with the idea of African gangs was just so out of proportion when considered, in relation to the actual scale of the problem. And I think you've covered this concept in previous lectures, but we could very much categorise this as a moral panic. So I'm going to leave this section of the lecture here for now, and I'll be back in the next section to talk to you about theories of ethnicity.